always thought my brother Mason would stand beside me for life. When we built our small tech startup, I believed we were one heart and one purpose. I trusted him more than I trusted myself. That morning, I walked into our office feeling proud of how far we had come. I greeted him by saying that we had another busy day ahead. He nodded and said he needed to meet an investor in the conference room. I told him I would prepare the demo, and he gave me a quick smile that felt real at the time. While arranging our files, I heard voices from the slightly open door. I was about to call Mason when I heard him say that the company was better off without me. I froze. The investor asked why, and Mason said I was slowing growth. My chest tightened. I whispered his name in disbelief, but no one heard. The investor sounded unsure, but Mason spoke again with confidence. He said he had already made changes behind my back. I stepped away from the door because my hands started to shake. I walked to my desk and opened the shared folder. I searched through our documents and found a new ownership record. My name was gone. I stared at the page and felt the floor tilt under my feet. I marched back to the conference room and pushed the door open. Mason looked at me with surprise, and the investor stepped aside. I asked Mason why my name was missing. He said it was a business decision. I told him it was our company, but he claimed he had built most of it alone. My voice cracked as I reminded him that we started everything together. The investor excused himself, and I asked Mason if he had planned this for long. He told me I needed to grow up and accept reality. I felt something break inside me. I asked if he even cared that I trusted him. He replied that trust did not run a company. I told him he had taken everything from me. He said I should be grateful he let me stay as long as he did. I felt my throat burn with anger and hurt. I asked if he wanted me gone right then. He said yes without hesitation. I walked to my desk and grabbed my bag. Mason followed and said this was the best choice for both of us. I told him he could keep the company, but he would lose something more important. He asked what that was. I said he would lose me. He did not respond. I walked out of the office and stepped into the rain. I felt the cold drops hit my face, as if the sky knew exactly how shattered I was. I kept walking because standing still hurt too much. I told myself that I would never forget the way he looked at me like I was nothing. I wanted to scream, but the rain washed the sound away before it reached my lips. I kept replaying every moment we had shared as brothers. I remembered late nights when we planned our future. I remembered the way he pushed me to dream bigger. Now I wondered if he meant any of it, or if he only saw me as a tool. My heart felt heavy as I reached the end of the street. I leaned against a wall and tried to catch my breath. A couple walked by and asked if I was all right. I told them I would be fine. I checked my phone and saw messages from clients asking about the presentation. I realized Mason had already locked me out of the company account. I lowered the phone and stared at the wet sidewalk. My hands trembled because everything I cared about had vanished in a single morning. I whispered to myself that I should have seen this coming. Mason had changed over the past year. He became more distant, more focused on status, more hungry for control. I ignored the signs because I wanted to believe in us. As the rain softened, I walked to the park near our office. I sat on a bench and felt the cold wooden slats through my soaked clothes. I asked myself what I was supposed to do now. I had no money saved, no backup plan, nothing to fall on. All I had was a brother who no longer wanted me in his life. I lifted my head when I heard a child laugh nearby. The sound felt strange in the middle of my pain. I watched the child chase a ball and wondered when life became so hard. I wiped my face with my sleeve and thought about going back to confront Mason again. Then I realized he had shown me everything I needed to know. I could not fight for someone who did not want me. I stood and took a slow breath. I told myself that my life was not over even if it felt that way. I walked toward the bus stop, feeling the weight of betrayal on my shoulders. I promised myself that I would rebuild from this moment. I sat outside the closed cafe with my arms resting on my knees and my eyes fixed on the wet pavement. I told myself I only needed a minute, but I knew I was falling apart. My mind kept circling around Mason's betrayal until it felt like the world around me was fading. I muttered that everything I worked for was gone. I heard a woman say she hoped I was not talking to her. I looked up and saw her standing there with a calm expression and a briefcase. She introduced herself as Grace Turner and asked if I was hurt. I said I was only hurt on the inside. She asked what happened. I hesitated, but something in her voice made me speak. I told her my brother had taken our company. Grace raised an eyebrow and asked how a brother managed something like that. I said he removed my name from ownership and told an investor the company was better without me. Grace sat beside me and asked to see the documents. I opened my bag and handed her the printed files I had taken before I walked out. She scanned the pages and asked if Mason had always handled paperwork alone. I said he liked control, and I let him have it because I trusted him. Grace looked at me and asked if I trusted him more than I trusted myself. I said I did. She sighed quietly and said trust was powerful until the wrong person held it. I asked if she thought the documents were real. She said they were not only real, but carefully planned. My stomach tightened. I asked how she could tell. She pointed at the signatures and the revised dates. She said they were spaced out in a pattern that suggested intention. I stared at the pages in disbelief. Grace asked if Mason ever mentioned needing more control. I said he mentioned wanting faster decisions, but I never thought he wanted to erase me entirely. She asked what he said when I confronted him. I swallowed and told her he said the company was better off without me. Grace leaned back and said that must have felt like being cut open. I nodded because the pain was still fresh. She asked what I planned to do next. I told her I did not know. She asked if I wanted to fight for what I built. I said I wanted to, but I felt too overwhelmed. Grace looked at me with a steady focus and asked if my fear was about losing or about facing my brother again. I said both. She nodded like she understood the exact weight I carried. She said fear was normal when betrayal came from family. I asked how she knew. She said she had seen enough cases to recognize the signs. I stared at the ground and said I must have been blind. Grace replied that people who trust deeply are never blind. She said they simply hope too much. I asked if she thought I still had a chance to fix this. She said I had more than a chance because Mason slipped up by leaving a clear trail. I felt a spark of anger rise and asked if that meant he could be held accountable. Grace nodded and said absolutely. I asked what I should do. She asked if I wanted her honest advice. I said I did. She told me to stop seeing myself as the weaker brother and start seeing myself as the co-founder who deserved justice. I told her that was easier said than done. She said every fight began with a decision, not confidence. I asked why she cared enough to help. She said she hated watching good people lose to greed. I felt embarrassment rise in my chest and said she barely knew me. She said she knew enough from the look in my eyes when I handed her the documents. I asked what she saw. She said she saw someone who had been loyal for too long and someone who deserved better. I sat quietly while her words settled inside me. She asked again if I wanted to fight. I said I wanted to, but I did not know where to start. Grace said she could guide me if I trusted her. I asked if she was sure she wanted to get involved. She said she would not offer help if she was unsure. I felt my breathing steady for the first time since the morning. Grace stood and said I did not have to face this alone. I stood slowly and thanked her again. She said gratitude could wait because survival came first. Her voice felt firm and comforting. I told her I would try to trust her guidance. She said trust would grow as long as I stopped hiding from the truth. I followed her toward the street, feeling strength return. I walked beside Grace as she told me we needed another chance. I asked where we would find help after everything Mason did. Grace said an investor named Daniel Cross still respected my work. I said Daniel once supported us but drifted away after Mason gained control. Grace told me that drift might hide something we needed to learn. I agreed to meet Daniel even though fear pressed hard against my chest. When I entered his office, Daniel greeted me with a tight smile. He asked why I looked troubled and whether Mason knew I was here. I told him Mason did not know because Mason had already pushed me out. Daniel leaned back and asked what caused such a sudden fallout between us. I placed the documents on his desk and asked him to read them. Daniel sighed and said he had already heard a different story from Mason. I asked what Mason told him and why he believed it without speaking to me. Daniel said Mason claimed I was unstable and blocking the company's growth. My stomach twisted as I asked when Daniel started doubting my decisions. Daniel said he never doubted my talent, but feared losing his investment. I asked if he believed Mason more because Mason acted confident and bold. Daniel said confidence looked safer than conflict during a risky expansion phase. I told Daniel I needed his help to expose the manipulation written in those documents. Daniel tapped the papers and said they were troubling but not enough for action. I asked why clear fraud was not enough to make him reconsider everything. Daniel said intention was hard to prove and reputation held more weight than suspicion. I reminded him that I helped build the company he invested in originally. Daniel nodded and said he respected that but still needed stability for his partners. I asked if he truly believed I would risk everything without a real reason. Daniel said he believed me but could not risk becoming part of my fight. I felt anger rise and asked if my struggle meant nothing to him now. Daniel said it meant something but not enough to jeopardize his financial security. I gathered the documents while telling him I did not expect pity or protection. Daniel said he was sorry and hoped time would help me recover my balance. I walked out of his office feeling like another door had slammed shut. Grace waited outside and asked what happened based on my defeated expression. I told her Daniel believed Mason and refused to support my attempt for justice. Grace clenched her jaw and said Mason worked faster than she expected. I told her Mason cut off every connection we had before I even noticed. Grace said I needed to stop thinking like a hurt brother and start thinking like a strategist. I asked how to think like someone who planned betrayal so perfectly. Grace said planning required understanding weakness, and Mason targeted mine easily. I asked if she meant my trust and the way I defended him constantly. Grace said my loyalty blinded me, and Mason used that blindness to gain control. I sat on a nearby bench and told her I felt weak and ashamed. Grace said weakness came from shock, and shame came from betrayal, not failure. I asked if she truly believed I could still stand against Mason now. Grace said she would not waste her time helping someone without potential. I told her I wanted to fight, but fear kept holding my voice down. Grace said she would not let fear decide how my future unfolded. I asked why she cared enough to stay when others had already walked away. Grace said she saw truth in my eyes and refused to let greed win again. I stood and told her I was ready to keep fighting forward. I sat across from Grace as she asked if I was ready. I told her I wanted answers more than anything I ever wanted. She said answers meant nothing unless I used them to fight. I asked if fighting was my only option now. She said Mason would destroy me completely if I stayed silent. I asked if she truly believed he would go that far. She said his actions already showed how far he was willing to go. She said fear existed to be challenged by those willing to rise. I told her I felt trapped between fear and anger. I said rising sounded difficult when the ground kept breaking beneath me. She said she brought someone who could help rebuild that ground fast. I asked who she wanted me to meet today. She said her friend Ava Brooks knew how to uncover financial lies. I asked if Ava understood what Mason had done behind closed doors. Grace said Ava understood more than most people in the industry. I followed Grace into a workspace where Ava waited calmly. Ava greeted me and asked for everything Mason ever controlled financially. I placed the files on the table and asked if they helped. Ava said she needed a deeper look before giving her conclusion. I asked what she expected to find hidden in those pages. Ava said people who chase power often leave fingerprints on stolen money. I felt my pulse rise as she examined the printed statements carefully. Ava asked if Mason ever made sudden transfers without my approval. I said he told me those transfers were for expansion projects. Ava pointed at a section and asked if I recognized the account. I told her I had never seen that account listed anywhere. Ava said the account belonged to a private fund under Mason's control. Ava said it meant he had stolen money directly from business revenue. I asked what that meant for our company records now. I asked if she was certain before my world collapsed further. Ava said the numbers were too clear for any alternative explanation. I felt something inside me shift when I heard her quiet certainty. Grace asked how I felt after learning the truth finally. I said something inside me snapped and refused to bend again. Grace asked if I understood the full weight of that moment. I told her I understood that I could not hide anymore. Grace said, choosing strength changed everything about how this battle would end. I asked if confronting Mason right now made any difference. Grace said confrontation mattered when supported by truth and evidence. I asked if she believed I had enough strength to face him. Grace said strength grew each time I chose action over fear. I stood and told them I needed to see Mason immediately. Ava asked if I wanted her to join me there. I said I needed to speak to him alone the first time. Grace said she trusted my decision even if danger waited ahead. I walked into Mason's office without warning and closed the door. Mason looked up and asked why I returned after being dismissed. Mason laughed and asked who filled my head with accusations. I told him I came because I knew what he had stolen. I said the documents revealed transfers he never expected anyone to examine. Mason asked if I seriously thought I could challenge him now. I said he underestimated me because he trusted my silence too much. Mason laughed again and said I was nothing without his guidance. I told him I had been surviving on hope he never earned. Mason said hope did not change the reality of power between us. I said power meant nothing when truth finally entered the room. Mason said truth could be bent by those who owned the narrative. I said his narrative ended the moment Ava exposed his secret account. Mason stepped closer and asked if I wanted a war with him. I said he already started the war by erasing my entire identity. Mason asked if I believed anyone would take my side now. I said someone already did and she would not leave my corner. Mason asked who dared to help me after his warning spread. I said Grace taught me to stand without shaking anymore. Mason said I was foolish for trusting strangers over family. I said family never steals futures or destroys lives for money. Mason asked what I planned to do with my new confidence. I said I planned to take back what I helped build. Mason smirked and said confidence did not guarantee victory for me. I said determination gave me more strength than I ever expected. Mason said he was still ahead in every measurable way. I told him the evidence would soon say otherwise to everyone. Mason told me to leave before he lost patience completely. I said leaving did not mean surrender, and he needed to remember that. I walked out without letting fear follow behind me again. Grace waited outside and asked how he reacted to the confrontation. I told her he laughed, insulted, threatened, and revealed his arrogance again. Grace said arrogance built the perfect trap for someone like Mason. I asked if she believed we now had the upper hand finally. Grace said we had enough to start turning everything in our direction. I told her I was ready to strike back with every truth available. Grace said the real fight began now, and she would guide every step. I paced around Grace's living room while she sat across from me typing quickly on her laptop. I asked her what she was doing, and she told me she was sharing Ava's findings with a few trusted investors. I felt a knot tighten in my chest and asked her if she was sure this was safe. She looked up and said I needed to trust her because this was the first step in weakening Mason's grip. I rubbed my palms together and told her that every time I imagined Mason discovering what we were doing, my stomach twisted. She closed her laptop and said fear was exactly what he counted on. She added that people like him stayed powerful because everyone around them stayed quiet. I told her I was done being quiet, but a part of me still felt like I was walking into a storm I wasn't ready for. Grace stood and told me someone wanted to meet me. I asked her who, and she said his name was Oliver Hayes, a journalist who had been waiting years for a chance to expose a corrupt CEO. My breath hitched, and I asked her if she thought talking to him was wise. She said truth had power only if I was willing to give it a voice. When Oliver entered the room, I immediately noticed his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He shook my hand and asked if I was ready to talk. I hesitated before nodding. He sat on the couch and opened his recorder, then asked me to start wherever I wanted. I stared at him for a moment before asking if he had ever watched someone he loved destroy everything around them. He said he had, and that was why he was here. I took a breath and told him about Mason. I told him how Mason belittled me for years, how he manipulated our parents, how he stole credit at work, and how he shoved me aside like I was disposable. Oliver asked me how long I had carried that weight. I told him it felt like my whole life. He asked why I never spoke up. I looked at him and said fear kept my mouth shut. Fear of losing my family. Fear of losing my job. Fear of losing the illusion that my brother cared. Oliver asked what changed. I told him everything changed. The moment I realized Mason would destroy me without hesitation if it meant protecting his image. I said Ava's discovery of his illegal transfers was the final proof that he lacked any boundary. Oliver leaned forward and asked how that made me feel. My voice cracked when I said it felt like being stabbed by someone I once admired. He asked if I wanted revenge or justice. I said I wanted to breathe without feeling like Mason controlled the air around me. I added that if exposing him was the only way to reclaim my life, then I wanted truth more than anything. When the interview ended, Oliver stood and told me my story would help people understand the real man behind the CEO title. I thanked him for listening. He told me his work was only beginning. After he left, I sank into the couch and told Grace that speaking to him felt like ripping open every wound I kept buried. She said wounds healed faster when the truth touched them. A few hours later, while I was eating in my apartment, someone pounded on my door. I opened it and saw Mason glaring at me with wild eyes. He pushed inside and demanded to know what I had done. I asked him what he was talking about. He shouted that investors were pulling out, deals were collapsing, and whispers about financial misconduct were spreading like fire. I told him maybe people finally saw what he really was. He stepped closer and pointed a shaking finger at me. He accused me of betraying him. I told him betrayal required trust, and he made sure I never trusted him. He yelled that without him, I was nothing.
My heart raced, but I forced myself to hold his gaze and told him he was wrong. I said I was done living under his shadow and that he no longer had control over me. He called me pathetic and warned that I would regret this. I told him regret was something I felt for years, but not anymore. He stared at me with a mix of shock and fury before storming out and slamming the door. I stood there shaking, unsure whether it was fear or relief pulsing through me. Grace called moments later and asked if I was all right. I told her Mason came here furious. She said that meant the cracks were widening faster than expected. I asked her if she thought we were doing the right thing. She told me the truth was finally winning and that I no longer needed to fear a man who built his empire on lies. I sat down and whispered that for the first time. I believed her. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the news on my phone when Grace walked in holding 2 cups of coffee. She asked me if I had seen the headlines. I told her I had and that it felt surreal watching Mason's empire crumble piece by piece. She placed the coffee in front of me and said this was only the beginning. I nodded but admitted that part of me still felt guilty. She told me guilt was normal when the person falling was someone I once loved, but she reminded me that I was not the one who pushed him into corruption. Before I could say anything else, a soft knock came from the door. I asked Grace if she was expecting someone, and she shook her head. When I opened the door, a woman stood there holding a folder close to her chest. She introduced herself as Sarah Quinn. I asked her how she found me, and she said she reached out to Grace after hearing whispers that I was the one exposing Mason. I stepped aside and invited her in. The moment she sat down, she looked at me with eyes full of exhaustion. She told me she worked under Mason for years and that she used to admire him the same way I once did. I asked her what changed, and she said he did. She said he began speaking to her like she was disposable, dismissing her ideas, blaming her for his mistakes, and threatening her job whenever she questioned him. I felt a sharp twinge in my chest and told her I knew exactly how that felt. She opened the folder and pushed it toward me. I asked what it was. She said it contained emails, financial statements, and internal reports Mason ordered her to hide. She said she kept copies because she feared he would use her as a scapegoat someday. I asked her why she chose to give them to me now. She said she heard that I finally stood up to him, and she believed I deserved the full truth. Then she whispered that watching him fall gave her a sense of freedom she had not felt in years. Grace leaned forward and asked Sarah when Mason started treating her that way. Sarah said it began the year he became CEO. She said power twisted him, or maybe it exposed who he always was. I rubbed my forehead and told her it was strange hearing someone else describe the same torment I lived through. She said she always suspected Mason treated his own family worse than anyone in the company. I told her she was right. When I opened the folder, my heart pounded. I scanned the pages and saw forged signatures, altered statements, redirected funds, and emails that proved he manipulated every department. I let out a shaky breath and said each page felt like another cut. Sarah said she understood because she felt the same whenever he lashed out at her. I thanked her for trusting me with this. She said I did not need to thank her because I gave her courage she never had. After Sarah left, I sank onto the couch. Grace sat beside me and asked what was going through my mind. I told her the more I learned, the more I realized Mason hurt far more people than I ever imagined. She said abusers rarely limit their damage to one person. She placed her hand on mine and told me she was proud of me. My chest tightened in a way I did not expect. I pulled my hand back slightly, not because I wanted to, but because the feeling scared me. She noticed and asked what was wrong. I told her I did not know how to handle everything happening inside me. She asked if I meant fear or something else. I swallowed hard and said it was both. She looked at me quietly and said I did not have to be afraid of her. My voice softened when I told her I knew that, but feelings were dangerous when my life was already a battlefield. She said strength did not come from shutting down emotions, but from choosing the right ones to fight for. I looked away and said I never expected a power shift like this. I said Mason used to control everything, and now I was the one holding the truth. She told me power was not about control, but about courage, and she believed I finally found mine. I asked her if she really thought I could rebuild myself after all this. She said she already saw me rebuilding every time I stood up instead of breaking. I exhaled and admitted that falling for her terrified me. She placed her hand on my shoulder and said feelings could wait until I felt safe again. She said what mattered now was protecting the truth. I nodded and told her she was right. She picked up the folder and said Sarah's evidence would change everything. As I watched her sort through the documents, a strange calm settled inside me. For the first time, I did not feel like the brother living in someone else's shadow. I felt like someone finally stepping into his own light.
I woke up to the smell of coffee and the soft sound of Grace humming in the kitchen. I walked in, and she smiled while handing me a cup. She asked how I slept. I told her I slept better than I had in years. She said peace suited me. I said peace suited her too. She laughed and said we were starting the morning like an old married couple. My heart pounded because I had been carrying something for weeks. I told her I needed to talk to her. She set her mug down and asked if something was wrong. I said no, something was finally right. She stepped closer and asked what I meant. I swallowed and told her I had been trying to ignore how I felt because my life was chaos. But every day with her made me feel like I could breathe again. She asked if I was trying to tell her something important. I nodded and said I cared for her deeply, and it was no longer something I could pretend away. She stared at me quietly before asking why I looked so nervous. I told her I feared ruining the one good part of my life. She took my hand and asked if I thought she had stayed with me out of duty. I told her I did not know. She shook her head and said she stayed because she wanted to, because she saw strength in me, and because she felt the same way. I felt something inside my chest uncoil. I asked if she was sure. She said she had never been more sure of anything. Weeks later, we stood in a small courthouse with no crowd, no ceremony, and no noise except our vows. I looked into her eyes and said she was the person who helped me stand again when I thought I was finished. She told me she chose a quiet wedding because love did not need an audience. When we walked out as husband and wife, I felt a calm I had never known. One morning after breakfast, she placed a folder on the table. I asked what it was. She told me she had something to confess. I felt my stomach tighten and asked if I should be worried. She smiled and said I should be curious instead. She opened the folder and revealed documents showing ownership transfer. I frowned and asked what I was looking at. She said she bought Mason's collapsing company. I pushed my chair back and asked why she would do that. She said she did it for me. I shook my head and told her she did not have to fix my past. She said she did not buy it to fix anything, but to give me closure. I asked what closure she thought I needed. She said I needed to see that I never needed Mason to succeed and that I had built something worth fighting for. I told her I was shocked she made such a huge decision without telling me. She said she wanted it to be a gift, not a negotiation. I asked if she realized Mason would come after us once he found out. She said he no longer had the power to hurt me. I asked how she could be so certain. She said because power was not something he possessed anymore. Later that afternoon, a heavy knock echoed through the apartment. I looked at Grace and she nodded for me to open the door. I took a breath and pulled it open. Mason stood there with eyes full of panic. He asked if we could talk. I stepped aside reluctantly. He walked in and looked around like he was searching for a lifeline. He asked me if it was true that Grace bought the company. I said it was. He told me I could not let her do this. I asked why. He said he needed time and resources to rebuild. I asked him why he thought I owed him anything. He said he was desperate. I told him desperation was not a reason to erase everything he did. He dropped into a chair and said he never expected everything to fall apart so fast. I told him consequences rarely waited for permission. He looked at me helplessly and asked if I hated him. I said I did not. He asked why. I said hate required energy, and I no longer felt anything. He stared at the floor and said he never imagined losing me. I told him he lost me the day he chose greed over family. Grace stepped beside me and asked Mason what he planned to do now. He said he did not know. She told him he needed to accept responsibility instead of searching for ways to shift the blame. He looked at her, then at me, and said he wished things had been different. I told him we all did. He stood slowly and asked if this was truly the end. I said it was. He nodded weakly and walked out without another word. When the door closed, Grace touched my arm and asked if I was all right. I told her I felt empty but relieved. She said emptiness meant I had finally let go. I looked at her, the woman who saw me break and still chose to stay. I told her she saved me. She said I saved myself, and she simply stood beside me. I believed her. I sat at my desk going over plans for the new company when a knock at the door startled me. I called out, asking who it was. Mason's voice answered hesitantly. I told him to come in. He walked slowly and avoided my eyes. I asked why he was here. He said he wanted to apologize. I told him apologies could not erase the past. He said he understood, but he still wanted a chance to make things right. I shook my head and said it was not that simple. He asked if I could ever forgive him. I told him forgiveness was not what I was looking for. He asked if I hated him. I said I did not. He blinked, surprised, and asked what that meant. I told him I felt nothing for him because I had already moved on. He asked how I could be so calm. I said I learned that calm came from accepting reality instead of trying to control it. He said he never imagined I would grow stronger from everything he did. I told him strength was built from surviving, not from revenge.
Mason sank into a chair and asked if I would ever want to work together again. I told him I was done living in his shadow. He nodded slowly and said he deserved what he got. I said he did, and so did I, for staying silent too long. He asked if I could help him rebuild. I told him no. He asked why. I said rebuilding required honesty, courage, and trust, none of which he offered me. He stayed quiet for a moment and then said he realized his choices cost him everything. I told him I was proud. I did not let him define my life. He asked what I planned to do now. I said I planned to build a new company with people who believed in me, people who valued honesty and loyalty. He asked if I was sure I could succeed without him. I told him I did not need him to succeed anymore. He looked down at his hands and said he had underestimated me at every turn. I said underestimating me was his greatest mistake. Grace entered the room quietly and stood beside me. She asked if I was all right. I said I had never been better. She smiled and told me I looked strong, calm, and in control. I said it felt strange to finally own my own life. She told me she always knew I would. I reached for her hand and felt the certainty of her support. I told her I would not let fear or betrayal shape me again. She said I had already proven that. I said it felt like a new beginning. Mason shifted in his seat and asked if I felt any satisfaction from seeing him fall. I told him satisfaction came from justice, not vengeance. He said he envied my peace. I told him peace was the only reward worth having. He asked if I regretted anything. I said I regretted only trusting him for too long. He nodded and said he understood that now. I said understanding came too late for him, but just in time for me. He got up and said he had nothing more to say. I told him he had finally said everything he needed to. He turned and walked out without another word. I closed the door and took a deep breath. Grace squeezed my hand and said, "This moment belonged to me." I said it felt like the first time I could truly breathe. She said we could start building together now. I smiled and told her that having her by my side made every past struggle worth surviving. She asked if I was ready for the challenge. I said I was, more than ever. I sat back and reflected on everything I had survived: betrayal, fear, humiliation, and loss. Each memory burned briefly, but I let it pass. I also remembered what I gained: strength, love, and a renewed purpose. I told myself I had earned the right to lead with integrity. Grace reminded me that life was about moving forward, not holding grudges. I said I finally understood that justice did not require hate. She said I had proven it. I felt light, as if every burden had been lifted. I picked up my notebook and began writing plans for the new company. I called the people I trusted most and shared the vision. I felt excitement for the first time in years. I told myself this was my future, built from my choices, guided by truth, and supported by loyalty. I looked out the window at the city and realized I had finally claimed a life that was entirely my own.
Mason had walked away with regret, but I walked forward with confidence.
I whispered to Grace that peace felt better than revenge ever could. She leaned close and said I had discovered the greatest power of all, the power to move forward. I nodded and said this was only the beginning. We would create something new, something honest, something lasting. I felt a calm resolve settle over me. I finally believed in myself and in the life I was building. Justice had arrived, without hate, without revenge, only with truth.